Welcome to day 24, where we are going to continue this process of interpreting the biblical data in specifically the law today. So we're in Exodus 33, where Moses is on Mount Sinai, just to give you context, and he really wants the Lord to do something for him. And what we're going to see is that he desires God to show him his glory. And then God will actually reveal who he is to Moses in Exodus 33:12 through 23. Okay, so Moses says to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you've not let me know whom you'll send with me." Right, so we have Moses here trying to figure out what God wants of him, and yet you've said, "I know you by name, and you've also found favor in my sight." Right, so we have Moses going, "I know what you've said, God. You know me by name. I found favor in your sight." Right, but you have not let me know who you're going to send with us into the promised land. Now, therefore, if I've found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. So notice how favor here is connected to Moses seeing the ways of God. And the ways here refer to the character, the heart. Who is this God of Israel? Who is the Lord? Moses wants to know his ways on a deeply personal and intimate level, where he becomes familiar in a good way with the heart of God. And so we see that happening. I'll let you know when we start interpreting this data. But for now, we do see a desire in Moses to know the ways of God, and he equates that to having favor in God's sight. "Consider too, this nation is your people." And then the Lord answers, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, and this is Moses speaking, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." So we have Moses saying, "I don't want to go into the promised land if you're not going to bring us up personally. If your very presence will not go with us, I do not want to go into the promised land." The data tells us Moses does not want to go into the promised land without God. The deeper the conclusion, the meaning, the interpretation is that to Moses, the presence of God is far more valuable than simply going into the promised land. His priority is God's presence, God's nearness, God being with him. That's Moses' priority. "For how shall it be known that I've found favor in your sight?" So Moses wants it to be known that he's found favor in the sight of God. "In your sight, I and your people. Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" So what this lets us know is that Moses sees God going with him and Israel into the promised land. Moses sees that as a sign of God's favor that the other nations, the people on the face of the earth, will recognize and go, "Whoa, they're different. Whoa, they found favor in the sight of their God," because God is clearly with them. And so Moses has the data's right there, right? That Moses desires for the people on the face of the earth to recognize Israel as being distinct. He wants Israel and himself to be obviously different from the surrounding nations, which is one of the main reasons he wants God to go with him, right? So that's the observation. That's the data we see, right? The meaning is that for Moses, the reputation ultimately of God is a very important thing to him, right? It's not just Israel, it's not just Moses, it's the fact that God is with them, and God is making a name for himself by going with Israel and giving them victory and helping them win and establishing them as a nation and giving them the promised land, right? That would show the people on the face of the earth, wow, they have found favor in the sight of their God. So the meaning here is that God going with them is deeply important to Moses because it has to do with God's reputation. Moses has a high regard for God's reputation in the earth. And the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you've spoken, I will do." So God actually answers Moses' cry, "For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." God is talking back to Moses. That's pretty cool, right? So God actually honors Moses' request. That's what's happening here. That's the meaning behind this, is that God actually honors Moses' request to go with him and to show him his glory. Moses goes, please show me your glory. This right here is kind of the whole point of this little story, is that Moses wants to behold the glory, the radiance of God's goodness. And he said, how does God respond to Moses' request? He says, I will. God honors Moses' second request to see his glory. And God says, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. Right? So the name of God, here's the meaning of this. The name of the Lord, the character, the goodness of God is not just something to be seen with his eyes. It's something to be experienced with all the senses. He's going to hear, Moses will hear the Lord proclaim his own good character and name. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Meaning, God intends to be gracious to some and intends to be merciful to some, right? That's the grace and mercy of God being seen here. But he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. Oof. And the Lord said, behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. Meaning, God is going to place Moses on this rock, right? And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. The meaning of this passage is that the goodness of God, the glory of God, the glory of his face cannot be seen by sinful man. In our fleshly, sinful bodies, we cannot behold the full glory of God, right? That's the underlying message. That's the meaning of this passage, is that God is merciful and he is gracious, but in our sinful bodies, in our fleshly bodies, which are temporary and fading, we cannot behold the infinite goodness and glory of God's face. But God does make a way for Moses to actually stand on this rock, right? Whatever this rock is, Moses is tucked in it to be able to see the glory of God as he passes by. This rock, the meaning of this little section is that there is a safe place of refuge that allows Moses to see the backside of God's glory. But notice how God covers him with his hand until he's passed by. The covering here is so that Moses doesn't behold his face as he passes by. It's once God's back is to Moses, then he'll take away his hand, and Moses can see the train of his robe, the glory of God from his backside, you might say, the majesty of God from behind, right? So this little passage really tells us how holy God's name is, how otherly he is, how massive his goodness is, how merciful and gracious God is, to let a man be tucked in a rock. The meaning of this rock, again, is that it somehow enables Moses to behold God's glory, and this hand protects Moses from being obliterated by the radiant goodness of God's glory. So it's a dual protection. It's protecting him so that he doesn't see what he shouldn't, and then this allows him to see what he can. But he's tucked in the cleft of this rock, right? And he's standing on this rock. What's the meaning? There's a rock that Moses needs to stand on and be tucked into to behold the radiance of God's goodness and hear the name of God proclaimed, which is what we'll see later in Exodus, that the Lord will proclaim his name. The goodness of God will pass before Moses. So the meaning of this passage, right, is that there is glory for, someone who is tucked in a rock and protected by the hand of God. And foreshadowing Jesus, I believe, is what this passage is doing. Foreshadowing Jesus, we know that he is the rock that we stand on. He's the rock that we're tucked in. He's the hand that protects us so that we can effectively behold and see the glory of God in his fullness, the goodness of God. And Jesus proclaims the name of the Lord. So there's a deeper meaning behind just what's happening in this present context. It actually points to Jesus in the future, where we'll see the meaning of this passage unpacked clearer when we see Jesus. So sometimes to get the full meaning of a passage and what it actually means, we need to see how it relates to Jesus, how Jesus fulfills that, how Jesus' work or his character or the story of Christ is foreshadowed in this little story. That's one of the most helpful tidbits I can give you, is when you're going, what's the meaning of this passage? The meaning here is that Moses, in order to behold the glory of God, has to be tucked in this rock, protected by the hand of God, and then the name of God is proclaimed, right? Now, that's the initial meaning, but, when you think of Jesus, Jesus actually is the goodness of God embodied. Jesus proclaims the name or the character of God perfectly, right? Jesus is the perfect act of God's grace and mercy to humanity to allow us to behold not just the backside of God's glory, but eventually his very face, right? So all of this points to Jesus, and sometimes the best way to figure out the meaning of a passage is think about, how does this connect to Jesus? How does this relate to who he is, what he's done, his promises, his word, his work, all of that stuff. Okay, so again, the deeper meaning or the surface level data is Moses desires to see God's glory, but the meaning of this passage is that, well, God is the one who alone can make provision for a person to behold his glory. And in this context for Moses, it's just the backside. Eventually, it will be the face of God that we get to behold in Jesus Christ. And eventually, when we stand before the Father, Jesus will give us, that righteousness to stand on, to have, that allows us to behold God's glory in its fullness. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful in you just making sense of the data. Again, the data is the what. The interpretation is like the deeper meaning, not just what, but questions like why, questions like how, questions like what does it mean? Not just what do I see, but now what does this mean? What is the interpretation of this passage? And I think if you were to sum up this whole story on a surface level, the observation is that Moses wants God to go with him in Israel to the promised land. And he also wants to see God's glory, and God answers that by making a way for Moses to see his glory. The interpretation of this passage, the meaning, what we can conclude is that God actually is the only one who can make provision for us graciously and mercifully to behold his glory, which is why he's going to provide Jesus the rock, who is also the hand of God and the face of God and the name of God. Jesus is that. And this is something you'll learn more and more as you just study Scripture. You'll see things like this. You'll make sense of these little tidbits where it'll kind of bring you back to Jesus, and you'll say, sounds a lot like Jesus. Yeah, maybe it has to do with him. So we've interpreted what we've observed and the meaning of this passage, boiled it down to a main point, you might say. What's the main point of this passage? What is God communicating in this to generations across time? Well, God is communicating that he actually invites humanity uniquely to behold his glory, but it's the way that God has made provision for that to happen. We don't come to God on our own merits or on our own conditions, right? We don't come to God on our own, by our own, decided plan and go, this is how you're going to let us see your glory. We come the way that God has made provision for us to. So I hope this was helpful. I'll see you guys in day number 25 when we observe not just what the prophets say, but we'll interpret the meaning of what we see in our observation. All right, so we'll continue interpreting in the prophets on day 25. I hope this was helpful. Again, just to end, when you're interpreting, what you're saying is, what is the main point that God is communicating? Of course, there's sub-points within that, but what is the main point, the main message God is relaying to humanity through this passage? Then I believe that in this passage, the main point is that, again, God makes provision for humanity to behold his glory. All right, I'll see you guys in day number 25.